Apple Studio display, and myself as a photographer couldn't be more excited to have an Apple branded 5K panel that has great color, great resolution, and just a great design aesthetic to actually be able to use in my office to edit all of my work. That being said, there are a few things that I obviously really love about it, and there are some things that I was pretty disappointed by. So in this video, we're going to talk about all of those things, and is it worth it for kind of a general consumer as well as a creative professional like myself doing photo video work. So a quick apology for the voice. My whole family has had a cold the last few days, and I'm just not in a place to be on camera, but definitely wanted to get this video out there. So that's why this video is just going to be full of B-roll and me talking about my experience. This is Apple's 27-inch 5K Retina display. Now, Retina means that it is coming in at 218 pixels per inch, which is at 5120 by 2880. This thing will put out 600 nits of brightness, support for 1 billion colors, wide color gamut of P3. Outside of that, it has an A13 chip that is helping to control and do all of the processing for the 12 megapixel camera. The aperture is 2.4 and it has the ability to do center stage. The audio that the display puts out is within a 6-speaker system that has force canceling woofers, wide surround sound, support for spatial audio, has a 3-mic array with a high signal to noise ratio. The connections on the back include one Thunderbolt 3 port, which would connect to whatever your computer of choice is, as well as 3 10 gigabit per second USB-C ports. The unboxing is pretty cool, but you really only just get a 1 meter Thunderbolt cable as well as the display. The power cable is just attached and does not come off. Now, a lot of people have pointed out this is basically the same display that has come in the 5K iMac for years. And to be honest, I've used that panel since it came out. I've had multiple iterations of that iMac, and I'm a big fan of it. I had used that iMac up until the M1s came out and was hoping for a new, more pro version of the iMac. And when Apple took a little longer to put that out, and they still haven't honestly put one out, I decided to buy a Mac Mini, which then brought me to using this LG Ultrafine. It's not the 5K Ultrafine that takes the same display, but it is, from their Ultrafine line, it is another 27-inch panel that is actually 4K and not 5K, which means that it comes in at 163 pixels per inch versus the 5K, which comes in at 218 pixels per inch, which might not seem like that big a deal, but when you're actually looking at this kind of stuff, you can definitely tell that the 5K display is much sharper. You can't really see the individual pixels as much. And for a display that is 27 inches, I think I've just been spoiled by all of Apple's displays for years now. And the idea of having a display that isn't to that Retina pixels per inch is a bit of a letdown. And so I know there are a lot of people that are just thinking, why don't you just get a 27-inch 4K display? Well, I did, and I can tell you that it is a big difference, especially when you are looking into, critically working with Photoshop and Lightroom and Premiere and all of these different programs. The viewing experience just is different. Now, I know a lot of creative professionals who only edit on laptops, and that just hasn't been me. From the time that I first got an external display and then the first time I got an iMac, I basically just felt as if I went from editing pictures to editing photographs. But honestly, having that larger display and seeing your photos in a size that you would actually print them on, even on my 16-inch MacBook Pro, a 2x3 photo comes in at almost exactly half the size in terms of actual inches. You're editing a photo that's around 8.5 by 5.5 or so, where on the 5K Retina display, you're editing an image that's up on your screen at about 17 or 16.5 by 11 or so, which makes a huge difference in the overall experience. You just see so much more of the detail, and it feels like you can appreciate more of what's going on there, and it just feels so much more immersive than editing on a smaller device like a MacBook Pro. Now, while I was using the LG Ultrafine 27-inch 4K display with my Mac Mini, I could definitely tell the difference when looking at the new panel when I got it in versus my iMac. Right out of the box, this 5K display looks very, very, very similar to my 16-inch MacBook Pro. Both devices are kind of on Apple's upper line of products, and they come calibrated from the factory. It's just one of those things that, like, I know what I'm getting out of an Apple device. I know what I'm getting out of an Apple screen from a Pro laptop and a kind of more Pro style monitor. We as photographers spend hours going over just moving things left and right, just a little bit on a slider. But then sometimes what you don't realize is if your stuff isn't calibrated correctly or to each other or anything like that, that all of that extra work isn't actually going to show up correctly anyway, because you probably don't have a panel that is showing you the colors that it's going to output to other people viewing them on an iPhone or another MacBook. Now, one of the critiques here is that the panel goes up to 600 nits of sustained brightness, but then doesn't go any further beyond that, like the new MacBook Pros. But honestly, just in regular use, sitting here, editing photos, editing videos, the panel can stay at 600 nits, where the panel on the MacBook Pro actually sits at 500 nits. So from just a general normal use case, the panel is plenty bright. And what's actually funny is the LG panel claims to be an HDR panel, but it only comes in at 350 nits. So I just feel like Apple's one of those companies that they could say that the stuff is HDR, but they're going to be a lot more conservative in those dealings because they do have such higher end products. And where I sit as a photographer, 600 nits is more than enough. If you ever took, your favorite print and stuck it next to the display, your print isn't going to have just like the darkest blacks and the whitest whites, because that's just not how things print out. The contrast levels on this display and the color that it puts out and the dynamic range is absolutely fantastic, and I have zero issues with it. Now, a couple of the things that, we're not really going to care about that much, so I'm not going to harp on them, but the camera that comes out of here is fine. I do not care about what a webcam looks like. It's not a big deal. You're just trying to get a face on a screen. So it's just one of those things where people, I feel like are freaking out about nothing. And another thing is the speakers. I'm not going to use them as my reference monitors or even just to listen to music. But I will say, right before I was making this video, I was doing some emails and doing some other things, and I just turned on specifically the display speakers instead of my other speakers. While the sound isn't as immersive as using a dedicated bookshelf style speaker with, a subwoofer and stuff, it actually does a really good job. And after a little bit, I had completely forgotten that I was listening to the speakers out of the display, and I was really enjoying it. So take that for what you will. Also, this is pretty random, and I don't think I've seen anybody else talk about it, but there is a little sensor on the very top corner on the left side of the display. It's probably a sensor for True Tone and some kind of ambient light thing, but it's interesting because I didn't notice it until I was specifically filming some stuff and then kind of saw a texture difference across there and went, oh, that's really interesting. Now that we've talked about a ton of the things that I do like about this display, there are definitely some that I am not very excited about, and I definitely want to make sure that I mention them here. First off, it's 2022. The bezels on this display are way too big. If you look at the camera in the placement of the bezels, you can definitely tell that that part could also be smaller. I think it looks fine and it works as a display, but my MacBook Pro has much smaller bezels. Even this LG Ultrafine has much smaller bezels. And really, it just feels like one of those things that they definitely could have done, but decided not to do, probably because they're going to put out another panel that is a little bit more expensive or something. Again, it's not a big deal in general use, but it just seems like an oversight and something that could have been very easy to do differently. The other thing that I was definitely not a fan of is the stand. It looks great. I like the ability to adjust it by the tilts, but it's just way too short for someone like me. I am over 6 feet tall, so it's definitely something that is, I guess, a little bit different for some other people. I definitely would have loved to simply buy one that just was taller off the bat instead of having to pay $400 for a height adjustable one. Another thing that just made no sense to me is that the power cable on the back isn't removable. They made an amazing looking MagSafe style one for the new iMacs, And I understand that those come with a brick and the power is internal on this thing. And it's gonna sit on a desk. I'm not gonna move it a lot. But still, it just seems like something that they just didn't want to spend the extra time to engineer. And honestly, for the price, seems really, really cheap. Another nitpick about this is the 60 hertz refresh rate. We've definitely been spoiled by the new MacBook Pros, the new iPad Pros, the iPhones that have that, 120 hertz refresh rates. I know a lot of people have complained about it, but for someone who's a photo editor, I do not think that's an issue at all. And I'm glad that I didn't have to pay more money to get it. And now the last thing to kind of jump into here is the price. $15.99 isn't cheap for sure. As I was looking, I found you could buy a 24-inch iMac with 16 gigabytes of memory for under $1,500 right now if you go on the refurbished site or look used. So it does just feel like this panel is more expensive than it needs to be. $1,600 isn't a bad price for this display. And while I feel like sometimes we feel like we're paying the Apple tax or whatever, just like when I'm buying things like Leica cameras, they just have a much higher resale value as well. And even if you look at those old Thunderbolt displays from almost 10 years ago, those things are still selling for a few $100s online, where I guarantee you any other panel from 10 years ago is not going to be anywhere near that. So I will say that while this is definitely a little bit more expensive than I would hope for, it's definitely going to retain its value a lot more than a lot of other displays. So I'm kind of okay with spending the extra premium on it, knowing that it's going to hold its value. And I know the sad reality is that I actually look at a display more than I look through a camera lens. So putting money towards something that is going to reproduce my photos really, really well, show me great colors, show me them in a very detailed way, just makes this panel absolutely worth it for me. It's definitely not necessary, but I will say that it is something that I really, really enjoy using. And honestly, it is just a beautiful display. It's something that makes the other things in my room look better. It has a very clean design language, great aesthetics. That's just another place where Apple is doing their stuff with aluminum instead of plastic. So it's definitely just another justification for me, at least, why this panel costs more than some of the other options out there. So thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to ask down below. Subscribe if you haven't already. And then if you are interested in what my recommendations are for photographers, I made an entire video about what computers to buy and what direction to go with all the new M1 stuff, and you can check that out right here.